Hello, welcome to Presume Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 67 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about application state variables. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch part 64, 65 and 66 of this video series. In the previous sessions of this video series, we have discussed about different techniques to send data from one web form to another. In this session, we'll discuss about application state variables. Let's look at a simple example first. Let's flip to Visual Studio. I have an ASP.NET web application project here with two web forms. On web form 1, I have two text box controls where the user can enter their name and email. And once they click on this button, go to web form 2, the user will be navigated to webform2.aspx. And on this web form, I have two label controls which will then display the name and email that we have entered on webform1.aspx. And to do that, we are going to make use of application state variables. So when I double click this button, the event handler gets generated. I want to retrieve the name from the name text box, txt name.text. And then I want to store that in an application variable. So application of, and I'm going to use the key as name. Okay, and along the same lines, I want to retrieve the email from the email text box and store it in the session in the application variable. So txt email.text will give me that, and I'm going to use the key as application of email. And finally, we want to redirect the user to webform2, and I'm using response.redirect for that tilde character to indicate, within the current web application root directory, I want to go to webform2.aspx. Okay. So this should navigate the user to webform2.aspx. On the page load event of webform2.aspx, I want to retrieve, the name from the application variable. So application of name. And look at that. In an application variable, just like session variable, you can store anything into it. And that's why when you try to retrieve, anything out of application variable, it's going to return that as an object type. Okay, now you have to typecast it to the type that you're expecting. In our case, we are expecting a string back, so I'm going to convert that to a string using toString method, and we are going to assign that to LBL name label. Okay, and along the same lines, I'm going to retrieve the email from the application level variable. So application of email, and then I'm going to store that in LBL email text box. That's it. Now let's go ahead and run this application. So when the web form loads, we should be able to enter the name and email. So let me enter test as the name and test email as the email. So I am able to send the data from webform1 to webform2, and we are using application level variables for that. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is application state variables are available across all pages and across all sessions. So application state variables are like multi-user global data. Whereas if you look at session state variables are available across all pages but for a given specific session. Session state variables cannot be shared between sessions. The session variable belonging to a specific session cannot be read by another session. Okay, but whereas application level variables are accessible across all pages and across all sessions. That's why we say application state variables are like multi-user global data, and whereas session variables are single-user global data. Application state variables are stored on the web server, just like session state variables. Application state variables are stored on the web server. But for session state variables, we have other options as well. We can store session state variables either in a state server, or we can also store them in a SQL Server database, or we can also provide our own custom session storage provider. And we have discussed about that in part 62, 63, 64, 65 and 66 of this video series. But whereas application state variables are always stored on the web server. And application state variables are only cleared when the process hosting the application is restarted, that is when the application ends. But whereas session state variables are cleared, whenever the timeout of that session is reached. Okay, which means at certain point of time the session variables are going to be cleared, but then application state variables are cleared only when the process hosting the application is restarted. Let's quickly look at an example. So now I'm going to run this. So when we run this, look at this application state variable. So if I navigate to webform2.aspx as it stands now, look at that. that is still being shown. So how long are these name and email are going to stay on the web server? They are going to stay on the web server until the process hosting this application ends or restarts. And what is the process that runs this application? The ASP.NET Worker process, which is nothing but w3wp.exe. So if I go to the task manager and click on this show processes from all users, we should see w3wp.exe. So when I end this, that's when the application state variables are lost. So now if I make a request for that, okay, and this is another important thing. Look at that. I'm trying to access an application variable, and this is not present because that's null at the moment. Okay, and it's throwing a null reference exception. Why? Because you're calling toString method on a null object. So that's why, just like session variables, it makes sense to actually check if the application variable is null before trying to access that and then use toString or any other method on that application level variable. So for example, something like this: if application of name not equal to null, something like that. So when you do a null check, if it is null, then that piece of code will not be executed. Do the same thing for email as well. Application state variables are not shared across a web farm or a web garden. Now, if you look at this, the application state variables are actually created on the web server. Now, in a web farm is a situation where the web application is hosted on multiple web servers, and then there is a load balancer. When different clients make requests to your web application, they will go through the load balancer, and the load balancer will identify the web server that is least busy, and it will redirect the request to that web server. Okay, that's a web farm. Whereas web garden is a situation where you have deployed a web application on a server which has got multiple processors. Okay, now in a web farm or a web garden, when a client makes a request, and when the request first goes to web server 1, let's say, the application state variables are created on that web server. And then if the subsequent request is made by this client, and if the load balancer redirects that request to another web server, maybe to web server 2, then on this web server we don't have those application state variables. So they are basically not shared between web servers. But whereas if it's the case with session state variables, if you want to deploy a web application in a web farm or a web garden situation, and you want the session state variables to be available across all web servers, then we have the choice of choosing an out of process session state mode, which is either state server or SQL server. But with application state variables, they're always stored on the web server. You don't have an alternative there. Okay, so the application state variables are not available on a web farm or a web garden. Application state variables are not thread safe. So application state variables have global access and all sessions can read and write to them. So there could be concurrency related issues. That's why you have to synchronize access to an application level variable. That's why application object provides lock and unlock methods. Now, before you try to modify an application level variable, you call the application.lock, which ensures that in a multi-threaded environment, when multiple threads are trying to access that variable, only one thread can enter this piece of code and change that variable. If at that point of time, if there are other requests try to come in, those will be queued until the unlock method is called by the current thread which is modifying the value. This way we can ensure that only one thread is able to modify that variable at any given point of time. So make sure you always use this lock and unlock methods to ensure thread synchronization, so that we can avoid race conditions, deadlocks, and access violations. And in this example, if you look at this, we are using application state variables in a wrong way. If the purpose is just to send data from one web form to another, you can use any of these techniques from 1 to 5. Application state variables should not really be, we shouldn't be using application state variables for the sake of just sending data from one web form to another, because they will be there in the memory for a very long time. And then the application state variables are multi-user global data. So one user session can change those values, the values belonging to another session. Okay. So if the requirement is just to send data from one web form to another web form, consider other alternatives. Don't use application state variables. But in an interview they could ask you what are the different techniques to send data from one web form to another. We can say application state variables. It's possible to send data using application state variables from one web form to another, but we shouldn't really be using application state variables for that purpose. So use application state variables only when the variables need to have global access and when you need them for entire time during the lifetime of an application, from when the application starts to when it terminates. Now, if you want global access for certain variables and for certain duration, then we have another object called cache object. We'll be talking about cache object in a later video session, but cache object can be used for that purpose because whatever you store in a cache object has global access. It can be accessed anywhere. But then a cache object can have an expiry set, so it's guaranteed to be cleared at a certain point of time depending on the expiry time. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.